Good morning. I hope you're all well. I think you all know that one of the things I said is today I want to spend some time shoring up our discussion of post-structuralism, performance, intersectionality, and Chicana and Chicano studies. Now, I know that many of these things may seem like they're obtuse or they're not important to our discipline, but they actually very much are. And you can see how Chicana and Chicano studies, and especially Chicana and Chicanx studies, is highly influenced by them. So I'll just remind you, we began the semester by talking about positivism. We talked about Marxism. We talked about semiotics. We've talked about Chicana feminism. And at this point, where we're going to move into is talking about Derrida and deconstruction. Derrida and deconstruction. Deconstruction. I'm asking you to think about Foucault, and these are really his methodologies. So Derrida's methodology is deconstruction, and these are ways in which they go about interpretation. And remember, all of these things are premised on semiotics to some degree. You can definitely see that with Derrida in particular. But Derrida, who's an important post-structuralist, remember, another way of talking about semiotics was in the terms of structuralism. Derrida is a post-structuralist, and his particular methodology that he's most well known for, his method of interpretation, is deconstruction. Then there is Foucault, who's incredibly influential for his methodology of his archaeology and genealogy. They're not exactly the same thing. They come at different periods, or they first appear at different periods in Foucault's development, but we can see that they're related, and they sit side by side each other in Foucault's later work. Then we get to Judith Butler, and with Judith Butler, this is the author of Gender Trouble. This is where performance theory, in the way it's mostly understood, comes from. I am a graduate of UT, University of Texas Anthropology, that folklore program, including the works of people like Paredes and Limon, and a bunch of other Chicana figures that came out of that program are known for a certain sort of anthropological performance theory, which was developed in the 1980s. But the way that most of us talk about performance theory today follows from Judith Butler and her key work of Gender Trouble. Now, you should start to see why this is particularly useful for thinking about Chicana and Chicano studies. Many of you have engaged queer theory. Many of you are firmly engaged with queer theory. And one of the key places that what we think of today as queer theory comes from is from Judith Butler and her notion of performance, that gender is performed. And again, you're going to see its relationship to semiotics. And this is included in the way many Chicanos, many Chicanx people are talking about it in our discipline today. Then we're going to move, and I want you to look at this classic work by Kimberlé Crenshaw, which is one of the first places where the notion of intersectionality occurs. And she is a legal studies scholar. There is a place where sort of performance theory, queer theory, and intersectionality all come to meet, but they're not exactly emerging from the same place. And again, Crenshaw is a legal studies scholar. And I think if you go back to this document and look at it, you will see the way she's talking about intersectionality is a little bit differently than the way people often take it today, in a way that doesn't appreciate the place it emerges from. And finally, we're going to return to Norma Alarcón, who wrote a beautiful work in the 1980s and 1990s, was extraordinarily influential. Norma Alarcón, and she writes about La Malinche, she writes about the Llorona, and she is a Chicana studies figure who was incredibly influential in the way Chicana studies emerged out of the 1980s. And what she does is one of the things that you would see that's very interesting. She draws on Foucault and Derrida. So, some of you are going, why am I having to read Derrida? For God's sake, why am I having to read Foucault? Well, it actually makes sense in the context of all this. They're influential. And if you don't realize that, you're not understanding all the complexities of our discipline. We are in dialogue with not only the Anglophone Enlightenment, but also continental Europe. And next week, we're going to engage that again when we get to decoloniality. I want to just take a moment and think about Derrida. And if you did not watch the videos that I put up in our YouTube playlist on deconstruction, on Derrida, on post-structuralism, this is the time to do it. I think it will help you. It will help you if you look at those, return to the works on Derrida and Foucault, and then come back to this discussion. So I'm going to take a moment and a pause. I'm going to pause here for about 5 seconds so that you can go back and look at those. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, let's go ahead and come back. So now what I'm going to do is I want to turn to just a brief discussion about deconstruction. Now that you've watched those videos, and what I'm going to go back to is our trusty John Hopkins Guide to Literary Criticism. The most current versions of this are called something like the John Hopkins Guide to Literary and Cultural Criticism, maybe Cultural Criticism and Literary Criticism in that order. But let's take a moment and look at that text. So folks, let's talk about deconstruction, which is this methodology which I described by Derrida and which you saw some of in the film, the short YouTube videos that you watched. Derrida says, or they say this, the author of this entry on Derrida says, in one of the typical analytical procedures, a deconstructive reading focuses on binary oppositions within a text. First, to show how those oppositions are structured hierarchically, and second, to overturn the hierarchy temporarily, as if to make the text say the opposite of what appeared to say initially, and third, to displace and reassert both terms of the opposition within a non-hierarchical relationship of difference. Okay, and this is where that term difference comes about. And if you just think about that and think about the way Alarcon and many of the people that you probably read go about their work, my supposition is that you'll find, in fact, it's very much like this. Now I'm going to look at this some more. And here is the section. It's up a little bit I want to talk about. Derrida's deconstructive method proceeds by means of slow and ingeniously close readings of text, focused on those points where a binary opposition, e.g., signifier, signified, presence, absence, nature, culture, literal, figural, outside, inside, a line of argument, or even a single word breaks down to reveal radical incongruities in the logic of rhetoric. Unlike ambiguity, irony, or paradox, these incompatibilities cannot be harmonized in the service of a textual unity or integrity, terms that for Derrida would be synonymous with self-presence. Instead, the contradictions expose the text to the force of its own difference, its displacement from a univocal center of meaning. They show that what a text says and how it says it do not converge, but simultaneously strive toward and defer convergence. Deconstruction always reveals difference within unity. And so many of the works, and at least several of you actually took an undergraduate class from me a number of years ago where we looked at some works that are by queer theorists thinking about text, and they draw on this. Many of the figures that you read in Chicana and Chicano studies, and you'll be able to see it in Alarcon later on, draw on this. So folks, again, now I'm going to turn to Foucault and his ideas, his methods of archaeology and genealogy. Foucault in general has been incredibly influential in Chicana, Chicano studies, particularly those of us who are interested in cultural studies, those of us who are interested in the complexities of texts, those of us who engage in performance theory or queer theory. And you'll see echoes of Foucault as well as Derrida when we look at Alarcon. So now what you are looking at is something that is from your reading. It's the entry on Foucault. Bear with me as we read what the author of this text has to say about Foucault's methods of archaeology and genealogy. So this is at the bottom of page 278 that I gave you from the John Hopkins Guide to Literary Criticism. This is the section which I describe as post-structuralism. So it's premised on semiotics, but he's rejecting systematic theory. This would be an argument with things like Marxism. If you read Frederick Jameson is a Marxist. He utilizes these theories of Foucault, but what he does is he always has a final horizon, which is a Marxist analysis. Now Foucault, now we're returning to the text. Archaeology is a systematic analysis of what Foucault calls the statements or enunciations in any discourse. Every discourse contains rules of formation that limit and shape what may be said. These subjects of formation are not at the disposal of the author, but come into play as the text is composed out of phase with the consciousness of the writer. Archaeological analysis may be thought of as an elaboration of the figure of the episteme, which Foucault employed so effectively in his book, The Order of Things. It may also be thought of as an art of social structuralist analysis, one that uncovers complexities within the text. The archaeological method, after all, was developed before Foucault turned to the problems of practice and power. Genealogy is a diachronic method, one that attempts to reconstruct the origins and development of discourses by showing their rootedness in a field of forces. Genealogy is a Nietzschean effort to develop a critical method that undermines all absolute grounds, that demonstrates the origins of things only in relation to and in context with other things. Genealogy disallows pure beginnings, those historical formations that deny their historicity by naturalizing themselves, absolutizing themselves, grounding themselves in the transcendent discipline principle. From the vantage point of those who hold to absolute principles, genealogy appears nihilistic, relativist, amoral. Hubert Dreyfus and Paul Rabineau argue more convincingly that together with archaeology, genealogy constitutes an analytic of finitude, one that undercuts metaphysical pretensions, overblown notions of reason's ability to ground discourse, but not ethical action in the best sense of the term. So now I'm going to remind you of what you saw in the videos about post-structuralism, where it showed that it isn't saying that all interpretations are equal. It says that there's not some absolute objective notion of truth that we can all simply get at easily and that we all simply see. It argues that for post-structuralists, everything is mediated by language. But as you saw in the videos that you were watching, some interpretations are better than others. Remember, with Foucault, we're talking about his methods of archaeology and genealogy. And these are widespread in many of the things that you're reading, especially if you're doing anything which is talking about signifiers, signifieds, anything that is cultural studies oriented. Folks, I'm going to ask you to get the document by Judith Butler on performance. So get that out, the document by Judith Butler on performance, which was part of your required reading. I am going to point out some sections in there which I think will help you to understand Judith Butler's significance. So this is the Judith Butler article on performance, which you have already read. Now, Judith Butler is so influential in queer theory. Much of what we can still call queer theory, what we call queer theory today, comes from Judith Butler. The article that you read is from when she was an assistant professor in the 1980s, I believe. At this point, I'm going to draw you back to some of the things that we talked about when we talked about semiotics. You recall that semiotics was about the structure of language. There was the signifier and the signified, which together make the sign. And that the relationship between the signifier and the signified, the referent, is arbitrary. What gives language its meaning and structure is its relationship to words like dog is referred to cat, man to woman, and so on and so forth. But then also the relationship in a string of words, which is language. And that's a brief and quick look at structuralism, but I'm just reminding you what we already talked about. But now, in this context of performance, let's also recall that I talked about these two things, langue and parole. Now, those are French words, and if some of you probably actually speak French, and you're laughing at the way I say them, but I think people who think about semiotics in English, cultural studies people, will know that that's the way we often say them. But langue is the system, it's language, and parole is the way we speak, it's speech. So if langue is the thing that exists out beyond us, that is somehow somewhat agreed upon, although it's messy and all this other stuff, and the parole is the way we speak. And the way I may have spoken about it at that time is I talked about how some people are virtuosos in their performance. So that you've got, music is an interesting kind of example, right? So music is a system like langue, like speech. I guess it's another part of the thing. And then parole is the way that it's performed. And there are people who are particular virtuosos. There are people who are virtuosos in their use of, say, a guitar. They're virtuosos in their use of an accordion. And in speech, there's also virtuosos. That's why there's great poets, and there's some people who are just extraordinary. And they don't have to be people who get things from the National Endowment of the Arts. Sometimes we know people who are in, say, villages in northern New Mexico who were particular virtuosos in language. And so performance is the way the langue is performed, is parole. And what we're going to see when we get to Judith Butler, as Judith Butler is particularly interested in the performance of gender and how that constitutes gender. So I've asked you to get out your reading on this, so you should have it in front of you. And now I'm looking at the Judith Butler reading, which is her article, Performative Acts and Gender, Constitution, an Essay in Phenomenology and Feminist Theory. And it just occurred to me, as I may not know the correct words, the correct pronouns for Judith Butler. So I'm going to try to use gender neutral ones. But with that, you can see how language shapes the way we think about gender. And at the same time, when we use it, we're recreating it every day. The way we talk about men and women resulted in those bathrooms that we have on campus, which then reconstitute gender. So on this page 519, Judith Butler writes, when Simone de Beauvoir claims, this is the second paragraph on that page, the first page of the article, which is page 519. Judith Butler writes that when Simone de Beauvoir claims one is not born but rather becomes a woman, she is appropriating and reinterpreting this doctrine of constituting acts from the phenomenological tradition. In the sense, gender is not always a stable identity or a locus of agency from which various acts proceed. Rather, it is an identity tenuously constituted in time, an identity instituted through a stylized repetition of acts. Further, gender is instituted through the stylization of the body, and hence might be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and enactments of various kinds constitute an illusion of an abiding self. This formulation moves the conceptualization of gender off the ground of a substantial model of identity to one that requires a conception of constituted social temporality. Some of you may be familiar with the way Althusser talks about how identity is called out in people. Althusser is someone who's also in this mix. And what Althusser was, for example, talking about, Althusser was a Marxist, is the way race, for example, is called out in people when they're walking down the street. But that doesn't mean that it's something inherent within them. It's the way things happen, for example, with gender and these gender reveal parties. The child does not know or care. That little embryo, that fetus inside its mother does not care whether it's a boy or a girl. But even before it's born, it is being described as a boy or a girl. And through whatever's revealed, however it's revealed through the color blue or the color pink. And then you know when a child, if there's a baby shower, one of the first questions has to be, is what is the gender of the baby? Is it a boy or a girl? And then if it's a boy, you buy it all kinds of blue things, and if it's a girl, you buy it pink things. Now, that little child, that little baby does not care what it's being called, but the gender is being called out in the child. So it's something which is social. Gender is socially constituted even before the child is born. So now let's look at this. This is returning to that page 520, which is what we're on now. If gender is instituted through acts which are internally discontinuous, then the appearance of substance is precisely that, a constructed identity, a performative accomplishment, which the mundane social identity, including the actors themselves, come to believe and perform in the mode of belief. So that child may come to believe and understand itself as a boy or as a girl, but it's certainly probably much more about these things which are social, which are being mapped onto the child, than anything inherent with the child. If the ground of gender identity is the stylized repetition of acts through time, and not necessarily a seemingly seamless identity, then the possibility of gender transformation are to be found in the arbitrary relation between such acts, and the possibility of a different sort of repeating, and the breaking or subversive repetition of that style. So, one of the cool things, and this is one of the ways that people talk about queer theory, is that if this is the way gender is constructed or constituted through this language, it can be disrupted, it can be recoded. And to recode something is sometimes what it means to queer something. For example, I've suggested that with Angelico Chavez and his depiction of the Virgin Mary in La Conquistadora, that where he talks in terms of I, with that, we can recode that and queer Angelico Chavez. Okay, so through conceptions of gender acts sketched above, I will try and show some of the ways in which reified and nationalized conceptions of gender might be understood as constituted, and hence capable of being constituted differently. And this right here, what you're seeing, is a roadmap paragraph. And each of you should have those at the end of the introduction of any of the essays that you write, in my opinion. In opposition to theatrical or phenomenological models, which take the gender itself to be prior to its acts, I will understand constituting acts not only as constituting the identity of the actor, but as constituting that identity as a compelling illusion, an object of belief. In the course of making my argument, I will draw from theatrical, anthropological, and philosophical discourses, but mainly phenomenology, to show that what is called a gender identity is a performative accomplishment compelled by social sanction and taboo. And that's the thing about the language, which sounds like, it's just language. Words can't hurt you. Well, they can, and they have force. They have the force, for example, in terms of bathrooms, in which if someone is in the wrong bathroom, some people will get incredibly upset. Language has force, and here it describes social sanction or taboo, and sometimes they can be damn serious legal ramifications. Sometimes there can be borders with barbed wire and steel. In its very character as performative resides the possibility of contesting its reified status. Now I'm going to take us to page 526. On 526, there is about 1/3 of the way through the paragraph that is on top of the page, it says, the act. So find that. I'm going to read this aloud. The act that one does, the act that one performs, is, in a sense, an act that has been going on before one arrived on the scene. And that's, remember, language exists before us. The semiotic system exists before us. Hence, gender is an act which has been rehearsed, much as a script survives the particular actors who make use of it, but which requires individual actors in order to be actualized and reproduced as reality once again. The complex components that go into an act must be distinguished in order to understand the kind of acting in concert and acting in accord with acting one's gender invariably is. The complex components that go into an act must be distinguished in order to understand the kind of acting in concert and the acting in accord, which acting one's gender invariably is. Actors are always already on the stage. You are always already on the stage. You're performers. You're using language. And you are constituting yourself and constituting the world in your repetition of the language that already exists. Actors are always already on the stage within the terms of the performance, just as a script may be enacted in various ways, and just as the play requires both text and interpretation, so the gendered body acts its part in culturally restricted corporal space and enacts interpretations with the confines of already existing directives. But as we've already discussed, these can be disrupted. Now I'm going to turn to page 531, which will be the last thing that we look with regards to Judith Butler. So bear with me for a moment. This is page 531. So this is the last sentence of this article. Judith Butler writes, "Gender is not passively scripted on the body, and neither is it determined by nature, language, and the symbolic, or the overwhelming history of patriarchy. Gender is what is put on, invariably under constraint, daily and incessantly, with anxiety and pleasure. But if this continuous act is mistaken for natural or linguistic given, power is relinquished to expand the cultural field bodily through subversive performances of various kinds." So because you recognize what it is, and people all the time are subverting the way gender is proscribed or ascribed in language, and that sometimes is described as the queering or recoding. Okay, and now we're going to turn to the next section, which will be Alarcon. Okay, so now what I want to do is actually turn to Crenshaw and the discussion of intersectionality. And one of the things that's interesting is I think Crenshaw, more or less, is more like the positivist or the empiricist that we saw early in the class. But Crenshaw is also incredibly influential in much of what we're doing in ChicanxStudies, where we're looking at the intersections of race, class, gender, and sexuality. All of these things as if they're axes which are intersecting. At the same time, I think it's useful for you all to now go back and look. Kimberlé Crenshaw is a legal scholar. She's not using the tools of semiotics. Nevertheless, many of the ways that we're talking about or using intersectionality today often is fully engaged with queer theory. I think that there is a particular intervention which I always want to remind people of. I always push people, and when we talk about Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, they often miss what Spivak is actually saying about the power of domination in that text. They're saying, of course, the subaltern can speak, but it's more complex than that. And this, in terms of intersectionality, what Kimberlé Crenshaw, her original intervention, her original way of talking about this, was particularly influential, is particularly useful, I think, even into the present. So, in this book, page 148 of this article, and you've seen and you've read it, so you can see that Kimberlé Crenshaw is a legal scholar who's thinking about legal cases and why a certain group of black women could not receive remedy from the courts for what the discrimination that they're experiencing. And that's because the experience can't be simply described as because they're women, or it can't be described because they're black. Because all black people are not experiencing the discrimination that they're receiving, nor are all women. But these women, these black women, are, I think, and I believe Kimberlé Crenshaw said, there's something systematic which is impacting them. And what you're going to see here is it's not simply about the intersections of, say, these axes of race, gender, class, and sexuality. It's also about a way of thinking about what happens at that intersection. And here the intersection is not simply axes of social categories, using a metaphor of what happens at a four-way intersection, for example, when you're driving and there's an accident in the middle of that intersection. And so this is page 148, and I'm going to bring it to your attention. Crenshaw writes, finally, courts such as the one in Travenol have held that black women cannot represent an entire class of blacks due to the presumed class conflicts in cases where sex additionally disadvantaged black women. As a result, in the few cases where black women are allowed to use overall statistics indicating racially disparate treatment, black men may not be able to share in the remedy. Perhaps it appears to some that I have offered inconsistent criticisms of how black women are treated in anti-discrimination law. I seem to be saying that in one case, black women's claims were rejected and their experiences obscured because the courts refused to acknowledge that the employment experience of black women can be distinct from that of white women, while in the other cases, the interests of black women were harmed because black women's claims were viewed as so distinct from the claims of either white women or black men that the court denied two black females a representation of the larger class. It seems that I have to say that black women are the same and harmed by being treated differentially, or that they are different and harmed by being treated the same, but I cannot say both. That this apparent contradiction is but another manifestation of the conceptual limitations of the single-issue analyses that intersectionality challenges. The point is that black women can experience discrimination in any number of ways, and that the contradiction arises from our assumptions that their claims of exclusion may be unidirectional. Consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection coming and going in all four directions. Discrimination, though an intersection may flow in one direction, it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. Similarly, if a black woman is harmed because she is in the intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or racial discrimination. Similarly, providing legal claims only when black women show that their claims are based on race or on sex is analogous to calling an ambulance for the victim only if the driver's responsibility for the injuries is identified. But it is not always easy to reconstruct an accident. Sometimes the skid marks and the injuries simply indicate that they occurred simultaneously. Frustrating efforts to determine which driver caused the harm. In these cases, the tendency seems to be that no driver is held responsible, no treatment is administered, and the involved parties simply get back in their cars and zoom away. So, what's being described here is an intersection, and it's the metaphor of an intersection of roads, which describes something real which people are experiencing, in this case, black women. It is about the intersection of these different social categories, but it's not simply a setting up of a hierarchy. You don't necessarily know what caused the accident or what is the cause of the oppression, but there is oppression there, nevertheless. Is it because of gender? Is it because of sexuality? Is it because of social class? Is it because of race? It may not be clear. Nevertheless, a group of people is being damaged. Okay, folks, so this is the last one, the last actual article that we're going to engage. This is the one by Norma Alarcón. Its title, I believe, is actually in Italian. I'm not going to attempt it, but it's the one about translation and la Malinche. So you should have that. You've read that, but I'm going to just highlight some sections. And I think that these will draw the connections all the way back to our discussion of post-structuralism. So now on page 62, which is in front of you, if we look near the bottom, you can see some of the connections. So here she's talking about the Malinche, and of course you know the Malinche is, and if you don't, there's something we should have taught you. The Malinche, of course, is Masin, the consort of Cortes, and within the key works of Mexican national literature, things like by Carlos Fuentes, and even more Octavio Paz, he theorizes Mexican identity and a sort of pathological Mexican masculinity in the Malinche. The Malinche being our mother, the mother of mestizos. And she is, but also betrayed us, because she is the person, she betrayed us by translating and siding with Cortes, who also, by this measure, is her rapist. And so that we, all of us, are a descendant from that union of the colonialist and our mother who betrayed us in that framing. It's so much so that malinchista is a term used in Mexico for a traitor. Hence the connection and the play that Norma Alarcón is doing with the title of this piece. So she is the person who translates for the colonizer. She is our mother who assented to her own rape. This is terrible. I'm not actually agreeing with any of this, okay? This is awful. So please don't take anything I'm saying out of context. This is a sexist, patriarchal, heteronormative, and everything else way of understanding these relationships. But I am referring to even Mexican national notions of this stuff. This is Octavio Paz, who I believe won a Nobel Prize for Literature and is one of the great Mexican writers of the last century. And his writing's beautiful, but it's also messed up. So Norma Alarcón is writing, and this is on page 62. He writes, in such a binary Manichaean system of thought, Guadalupe's transcendent power, silence, and maternal sacrifice are the positive, contrasting attributes to those of a woman who speaks as a sexual being and independently of her maternal role. So within this, it's talking about within Mexican national identity and the way we talk about it as Mexican Americans, in my own experience, is there's Guadalupe on one side and La Malinche on the other. Guadalupe being the ideal and the Malinche being the betrayer and the opposite of that. And by the way, this goes back to the centers of the language. This is sexist, this is patriarchal, this is all kinds of terrible things. Her maternal role, as Malinche did, is viewed in such a society as a sign of catastrophe. For she is allowed to articulate her needs and desires. She must do so as a mother on behalf of her children and not of herself. Because Malinche, as the translator, is perceived as speaking for herself and not the community. She is a woman who has betrayed her primary cultural function, maternity. This figure of the mother is bound to a double reproduction, that of her people and her culture. In a traditional society organized around metaphysical or cosmological figurations of good and evil, cultural deviations from the norm is not easily tolerated nor valued in the name of inventiveness or originality. It is a setting to speak or translate in one's behalf, rather than the perceived group interests and the values. It is tantamount to betrayal. Thus, the assumption of an individual non-maternal voice, such as that of Chicanas during and after the Chicano movement, has been to label them as Malinches. So all these Chicanas, all of you Chicanas, after the movement who are talking for yourselves, by some consequently prompting Chicanas to vindicate Malinche in a variety of ways, as we shall see. Now, thinking back to our discussion there's this of Judith Butler, when we were looking at performance, and this issue of langue and parole, and there's this language, this system, this structure, which is patriarchal, which is oppressive, which dominates women. And then Chicanas are behaving badly. They're not doing what they're supposed to. But within this frame, okay, it's going to look at that as how Chicanas are vindicating themselves through this deviation from the structural language. They're performing who they are differently than is prescribed, and they receive social sanction, but maybe, and I think they are, transforming the way we think of these things. So now I'm going to turn to page 71. Thus, in order to break with tradition, Chicanas as writers and political activists simultaneously legitimate their discourse by grounding it in the Mexican Chicano community and by creating a speaking subject in their reappropriation of Malinche from Mexican writers in Chicano oral tradition. Through her, they began a recovery of aspects of their experience as well as their language. In this way, the traditional view of femininity invested in Guadalupe is avoided and indirectly denied and reinvested in a less intractable object. Guadalupe's political history represents a community's expectations and utopic desires through divine mediation. Malinche, however, as a secularly established speaking subject, unconstrained by religious beliefs, lends herself more readily to articulation and representation, both as subject and object. So she's the subject and the object. In a sense, Malinche might be led to represent herself, to become a subject of representation, and the closest she can come into this is by sympathizing with later-day speaking female subjects. So you can see how Chicanas are reappropriating and recoding Malinche as something else. This speaks to the kind of maneuvers that we're seeing in Judith Butler. Now I'm going to move to page 86. And this is the end, but you're gonna have to bear with me for a moment while I read the rest of this. And so Norma Alarcón says, and I think she's actually pretty cool, Alarcón is. And she's doing things that look like archaeology, they look like genealogy, they look like deconstruction. She is conversant with all of them, and she is using them, and she's turning them to her purposes as a Chicana feminist who is recoding Malinche. And she writes, and I'm going to begin with that "and" in the last sentence of this first paragraph. And what about the women who remain the internalized others? What is the one who submit or are offerings to the colonizers? What can we make of such gifts? Do they become the Mayan woman in the epigram, a woman in the service of violence against herself? Much of the Chicana feminist work of the 70s, like the Anglo-American feminist work, was launched. Okay, this is where I'm going to cut the last section where I started reading. So she writes, much of the Chicana feminist work of the 70s, like Anglo-feminist work, was launched around the assumption of a unified subject, organized oppositional to men from a perspective of gender differences. So much of this, and this is what I was talking about when I was talking about positivism, when I was talking about empiricism, much of the work comes from that perspective in the 70s and 80s, and some of it still does. And that's still good work, but they're doing something else. The assumption that the subject is autonomous, self-determining, and self-defining often has been a critical space shared by many feminists because it opens up vistas of agency for the subject. Often the critical space has generated the notion, especially among Anglo-Americans, that women's oppression can be described universally from the perspective of gender difference, as if boundaries of race, ethnicities, or class have not existed. Okay, skip that. The fact that Todorov also shares that critical space makes it possible for him to project onto La Malinche observations similar to those of Chicanas, ironically even more similar than those of Mexican men. The Mexican men do not forget that she is an Indian and a woman, thus making it possible for them to understand the betrayal on the grounds that she would not want to remain in the service of violence against herself. However, to the extent that we know it, the story of La Malinche demonstrates that crossing ethnic and racial boundaries does not necessarily free us from the violence against herself. Moreover, once her usefulness is over, she is silenced and disappears from the record, precisely because she is an Indian and a woman. She crosses over to a site where there is no legitimate place for her in the conqueror's order. Crossing over by choice or by force become sporadic arrangements that do not necessarily change the status of Indian women or women of color. For example, the realization that the invitation to cross over, when it is extended, does not ameliorate the lot of women of color in general, has led in the 80s to a feminist literature by Chicanas and women of color, which demonstrates that despite some shared critical perspectives, boundaries exist and continue to exist, thus accounting for differential experiences that cannot be contained under the sign of a universal woman or women. Yet for Mexicans, Guadalupe is a symbol that continues to exist for the purpose of universalizing and containing women's lives within a discrete cultural banner that may be similar to those of other cultures. On the other hand, the diverse 20th century interpretations of La Malinche rupture the stranglehold of religion by introducing the notion of historical, sexual, and linguistic agency, though not necessarily available to La Malinche herself in the beginning of the Mexican colonial period. So what's happening here is La Malinche is being recoded. Okay, folks, so I just want to sum up, and I want to remind you that what we've been talking about, we've gone from positivism, Marxism, semiotics, and Chicana feminism, and we've thought of Chicana feminism as a lens which could be used in different ways. So you can be an empiricist and be a Chicana feminist, or you can be Norma Alarcón, who's thoroughly post-structuralist and is a Chicana feminist. And what I've tried to show is these connections, how people like Derrida and Foucault, who are post-structuralists, speak back to semiotics, and what they're doing is incredibly influential in Chicana and Chicano and Chicanx studies today. Much of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about Chicano cultural studies, when we're talking about queer theory, actually owe a debt to people like Derrida's method, I'll remind you, is deconstruction. Foucault uses archaeology and genealogy. Then we get to Judith Butler, and she is known for performance theory. She particularly looked at how gender is performed. This brings us back to the discussion that we had before about Long and parole when we were talking about semiotics. Long being the system or the structure, parole is the speech. The parole is the performance. And with Long, before, when we were talking about structuralism, it was mostly thinking about how the structure simply exists and it's simply repeated. But with Judith Butler and with other people who are engaged in performance theory, they look at how language is continually reconstructed and created through that performance, and they actually show how at moments that can be disrupted and changed. That's what Judith Butler does. She looks at how gender is performed and reconstituted through that performance, how that's incredibly destructive and can be incredibly oppressive. At the same time, there can be interventions in which it is changed or transformed by people about us, that we have some level of agency in our parole, in our performance. Then we've seen and you read a specific scholar, Chicana scholar, who's looking at performance too, and was actually developing it at the same time as Judith Butler. We didn't go into discuss her really, but that was the purpose. You can see Chicano scholars were also participant in that. Of course, Judith Butler is the one with incredible influence, and many of you have read Gender Performance and Gender Trouble. And if you haven't read Gender Trouble, you probably should. Now, then we turn to Kimberlé Crenshaw, who actually is a positivist or empiricist. She's a legal scholar. She's going about her work that way. But in her close attention to language and in her legal scholarship, she brings us to intersectionality and into a way of thinking and talking about the relationship of gender, class, sexuality, and race, all into conversation in a way that is incredibly useful, that we talk about all the time today. And this is what people are usually talking about when they're talking about critical race theory. Nevertheless, even though she's probably up here with those folks, what she is doing is really conducive and fits well with post-structuralism. And many of the Chicanos who are talking about queer theory, talking about such things like that, Chicanx queer theory, and Chicanas were so influential in the construction of queer theory. People like Anzaldúa and Sherry Moraga are so influential in the construction of queer theory. And Norma Alarcón was with them, and she was a participant in those discussions that led to that famous book when Moraga and Anzaldúa were writing this bridge called My Back. Norma Alarcón was part of them. Meanwhile, Kimberlé Crenshaw's coming up with her notions of intersectionality, which speak to us. But I did point out how what she was actually talking about was the intersection of a road, and using that metaphor. And I think that continues to be useful today, and I like to intervene by reminding people of that metaphor. And then finally we got to Norma Alarcón. Norma Alarcón, she's born in Mexico. She's an important Chicana, a queer theorist figure. She wrote about things like the Llorona. She wrote about La Malinche and what you read for today. And what she's doing is utilizing the theories and methods of Foucault, Derrida, probably also Althusser, but I'm not getting into that, and Derrida's methods of deconstruction, Foucault's methods of archaeology and genealogy. Norma Alarcón, this key Chicana feminist, as using these post-structuralists. So this stuff does come back together. There is a reason I'm having you read this. This stuff is influential. And if you're one of the people who goes, why do I have to read that? Why do I have to pay attention to the Enlightenment with positivism? Why do I have to pay attention to continental European theory? Well, you're often doing work which is directly indebted to it and may have the problems with it because it comes from these people, particularly these people. If you don't like them, be aware of how they're influencing the way you go about your work. Think about how they influence our discipline. And you can take them to task. You can take Marx to task. But he influences us. Derrida influences us. Foucault influences us. Judith Butler influences us. I hope you enjoy the Norma Alarcón piece. I think it's good, and I would like to read it every semester. And with that, we'll call it a day.